Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Ghost Frequency. Tonight, we descend into the shadowed waters of true maritime terror with 9 unsettling accounts from cruise ships. These are not campfire tales or internet rumors. They come straight from passengers, crew members, and travelers who witnessed something so disturbing aboard these massive floating resorts that it changed the way they see the ocean forever. Each story comes from real testimonies, raw, unfiltered, and born far from land, where there's no escape and no turning back. Out there, surrounded by endless water and darkness, fear becomes your only companion. If you're new to Ghost Frequency, consider subscribing for more true horror that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Now let's step aboard and discover what happens when a dream vacation drifts into a waking nightmare, and the ocean becomes a silent witness to terror. Back in March 2019, my wife Sarah and I decided to celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary with a cruise. We had been talking about it for years, but between work and saving money, the timing never seemed right. Finally, we booked a 10-day Mediterranean voyage aboard the Royal Caribbean's Oasis of the Seas, one of those massive ships that functions almost like a city at sea, with over 6,000 passengers and crew members combined. The ship was colossal, every sense of the word. When we first stepped aboard at the port in Barcelona, I felt as though we'd entered an alternate reality. There were multiple pools, rock-climbing walls, zip lines, theaters that looked like Broadway, and more restaurants than I could count. Our cabin was on deck 9, starboard side, with a small balcony overlooking the endless blue of the Mediterranean. For the first few days, everything was perfect. A dream vacation. We ate too much, drank too much, and explored every inch of this floating paradise. The ship became our entire world, and honestly, we loved every minute of it. It was on the 4th day at sea, somewhere between the coasts of Italy and Greece, when I first noticed her. We were having breakfast in the main dining room on deck 3, when I saw a woman sitting alone at a table by the windows. What caught my eye wasn't just that she was alone. Plenty of solo travelers enjoy cruises. There was something about her that felt off. She was probably in her mid-40s, with shoulder-length brown hair, dressed in a bright yellow sundress that seemed oddly cheerful given her somber demeanor. She kept glancing around the dining room as if searching for someone, constantly checking her phone, barely touching her food. Sarah noticed me staring and asked what was wrong, but I just waved it off, saying it was nothing. Later that afternoon, while lounging by the adults-only pool on deck 11, I saw her again. This time she was walking along the promenade deck, still in that same yellow dress, looking around frantically. She approached several crew members, showing them what appeared to be a photograph, but each conversation ended with them shaking their heads apologetically. There was an unmistakable desperation in her body language that made me deeply uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite explain why. When Sarah went back to our cabin for a nap, I found myself trailing her at a distance, curious about what was causing her obvious distress. I watched as she went to the guest services desk on deck 4, where she spent nearly an hour speaking with various staff members. Even from across the atrium, I could see her growing more agitated. Her voice rose, though I couldn't make out her words, and she waved her arms wildly. The staff behind the desk tried to stay professional, but I sensed their frustration mounting as they handled her demands. Finally, a security officer in a white uniform approached her privately and spoke with her for a few minutes before escorting her away from the counter. That evening, over dinner at our usual table, I brought up the woman to our tablemates, an elderly couple from Ohio named Frank and Betty, who had been on dozens of cruises. When I described the woman in the yellow dress, Betty's face suddenly paled. "Oh, honey," she whispered, leaning in. "We heard about her. She's looking for her traveling companion. Her friend never returned to their cabin 2 nights ago, and nobody's seen her since. Ship security has been quietly investigating, but they're not saying much. These things happen more often than people realize, but the cruise lines don't exactly advertise it. Frank nodded grimly. Security's been keeping it under wraps, but it's more common than you'd think. They prefer to keep it quiet. The next morning, I woke up around 6, unable to sleep, and decided to take a walk before the ship's usual bustle began. The early hours on a cruise ship have a strange, almost eerie atmosphere. These ships, normally teeming with thousands, become ghost towns, with only the hum of engines and the occasional crew member in sight. As I strolled along Deck 7, I heard voices around the corner near the lifeboats. Curiosity pushed me closer, and I peeked to see her, now in jeans and a t-shirt, engaged in a heated conversation with 3 crew members. One, a man with a captain's stripes, was trying to calm her down, while the other 2 looked uncomfortable. "You're not listening to me," she exclaimed, her voice cracking with emotion. "Amanda wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave without telling me. We've been best friends for 20 years. Something's happened to her, and you're all acting like she's just gone on vacation. She has diabetes. She needs her insulin, which is in our cabin. She's been missing for 3 days now." The weight of her words hit me like icy thunder. This wasn't a simple case of someone wandering off or having an argument. It was about someone in serious medical danger, or worse. My stomach twisted as I listened from behind the lifeboat, hidden but unable to turn away. The senior crew member's tone turned more resolute. "Ma'am, we're aware of her medical condition, which is why we've escalated this to the authorities. We've contacted the Coast Guard and are conducting a thorough search of the vessel. We're reviewing all security footage from the past 72 hours. But you must understand, on a ship this large, with so many passengers, it's entirely possible she's in a place we haven't checked yet." She pressed further. "What about the cameras? You must have them everywhere. Last time you saw her on video." There was an awkward pause. The officer finally responded. "The last confirmed sighting was at 11:47 p.m. Tuesday, leaving the schooner bar on Deck 4. After that," he trailed off, voice quiet. "After that, she vanished." A sob escaped her, the frustration and despair palpable. So, in just 5 minutes, she went from the bar to our cabin, and somehow she just disappeared, in the middle of the ocean. I couldn't take any more. The scene was too sickening, and I realized I'd been eavesdropping on what was likely the worst moment of her life. Quietly, I backed away and returned to our cabin. Sarah was getting ready for the day, and when she asked why I looked so pale, I told her everything I'd overheard. The rest of the cruise felt different, tainted. What had once been a carefree escape now seemed sinister and claustrophobic. Every corridor looked suspicious. Every shadow seemed to hide something. The vastness that once impressed us now felt threatening, full of dark corners and echoes of emptiness. We learned from others that the missing woman was Amanda Mitchell, 43, from Portland, Oregon. In response, the crew had quietly upped security. More staff appeared in public areas, and subtle announcements urged passengers to report anything unusual. Still, life on the ship continued for most, as if nothing had happened. People sunbathed, attended shows, and dined without concern, unaware of the sinister shadows lurking behind the polished surface of their floating paradise. On our final night aboard the ship, as we packed our belongings, Sarah discovered a folded note slipped under our cabin door. It was handwritten in shaky, uneven script. "If you're the man who was listening near the lifeboats yesterday morning, please meet me at the solarium on Deck 11 at midnight. I need to tell someone what really happened to Amanda before we dock tomorrow. The crew won't listen." Signed, Jennifer. I showed the note to Sarah, and we argued for over an hour about whether we should go. Part of me wanted to hear what Jennifer had to say, but another was terrified of what I might learn. In the end, curiosity got the better of me, and at 11:55 p.m., we headed to the solarium, a quiet, glass-enclosed pool area, usually deserted at night. Jennifer was already there, sitting on a lounge chair, staring out at the darkened ocean. She looked years older than she had a few days earlier, her face marked by exhaustion and fear. When we approached, she looked up with red, swollen eyes and thanked us for coming. What she revealed next shattered everything I thought I knew about cruise ship safety. "Amanda," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't just missing. She had been scared of someone on this ship. She'd been receiving strange notes slipped under their cabin door, and someone had been shadowing her for days. Jennifer thought I was paranoid when I suggested reporting it to security, but she was genuinely terrified. The night Amanda disappeared, she went to the bar to meet someone claiming to have information about the stalker. She never returned. Jennifer explained she'd been trying to get the crew to take the harassment seriously, but they dismissed her concerns as typical cruise ship drama. The threatening notes had been found in their cabin's trash after Amanda vanished, but when Jennifer brought them to security, they brushed it off, saying Amanda had likely thrown them away herself and was overreacting. They treated it as just drunken rambling, nothing more. We docked in Barcelona at dawn, and I never learned what ultimately happened to Amanda Mitchell. Jennifer gave me her contact details, begging me to reach out if I learned anything, yet I never did. When I returned home, I searched online for missing cruise passenger stories and was stunned to discover how common these disappearances actually are. Many cases remain unresolved, and the danger on cruise ships seemed far more real than I had ever imagined. The ocean's vastness and its unforgiving nature mean that once you're in international waters, the rules of law become grimy and blurry. I still think about Amanda sometimes, wondering if she fell accidentally overboard, if someone pushed her, or if somehow she's still alive somewhere out there. But mostly I remember Jennifer's desperate, helpless eyes as she watched her best friend vanish into the Mediterranean night without a trace. In August 2017, I decided to celebrate my 30th birthday with a solo cruise. I'd been reassessing my life amid a difficult divorce, and my therapist suggested that some time alone might help me process everything and find clarity. I booked a 7-day Eastern Caribbean voyage on the Norwegian Dawn, thinking that being surrounded by tropical waters and lively entertainment would be the perfect distraction from the chaos I was leaving behind. As a woman traveling alone, I was initially nervous, but everyone told me cruise ships were safe, secure environments with guards everywhere. The Norwegian Dawn was a mid-size vessel, about 2,400 passengers, which felt intimate compared to the massive floating cities I'd seen advertised. My cabin was on Deck 8, an interior room without a balcony, though I'd paid extra for a larger space since I planned to spend a lot of time there. The first few days were exactly what I needed, sleeping in, eating anything I wanted, lounging by the pool, and enjoying the nightly shows without fretting about schedules or companions. For the first time in months, I was starting to remember who I was before the marriage fell apart. On the third day, while we were docked in St. Thomas, I met Marco. Returning to my cabin around 10 p.m. after exploring Charlotte Amalie, I struggled with my keycard. Its magnetic strip seemed malfunctioning, and no matter how many times I swiped, the door refused to open. After several frustrating attempts, a crew member appeared at the end of the hall and offered help. Marco was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and an accent I couldn't quite place. Italian, maybe Spanish. Dressed in the uniform of the housekeeping staff, he took my keycard and managed to open the door on his first try, claiming he knew all the ship's secrets after 8 years working on board. I thanked him and was about to step inside when he continued the conversation. "Are you traveling alone?" he asked. I nodded, noting that only my belongings were in the cabin. His gaze lingered a little too long as he added, "I've been cleaning your room every day, and it's only your things. That's brave, traveling solo. Many women are too scared." His tone was friendly, almost sympathetic, but his words felt off, as if he was paying too much attention to my personal space. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking my entry slightly. "Many women can't do it alone on a cruise, but you seem very independent," he said, the last word slow and deliberate. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I mumbled that I was tired and needed sleep, rushing past him and securing the door with the deadbolt and latch. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe Marco was just being friendly, and I was paranoid because of the divorce. But that afternoon, returning to my cabin, I immediately noticed something strange. My clothes, scattered around earlier, had been neatly organized. The disarray I'd left was gone. Now everything was arranged in precise stacks, even my underwear. Most unsettling was my journal, hidden in the bottom of my suitcase in private, now sitting openly atop the pile, as if someone had been reading it and couldn't bother hiding the fact. That night I took my keycard, phone, and valuables with me whenever I left, unwilling to leave anything to chance. When I returned around midnight, Marco was waiting just outside my door, sitting on a housekeeping cart, pretending to fold towels. When he saw me, his face lit with that same uncomfortable smile. "Ah, perfect timing," he said as he rose and moved to block my way. "I wanted to see you tonight. I'm sorry if I seemed too forward yesterday. Sometimes my English doesn't quite say what I mean." His language sounded fine, but I nodded politely, anxious to get inside. Instead, he stepped closer. "I've been thinking about you all day," he said softly. "It must be lonely traveling alone, having dinner alone, watching shows with no one to discuss them afterward. Maybe you'd like some company tomorrow night? I get off at 2 a.m. and know some places on board where passengers never go. Very private, very romantic." I firmly told him no, that I was perfectly happy alone and didn't need company. But Marco's smile darkened, and his tone took on a threatening edge. "You're just shy," he said, reaching out to touch my arm. "American women, they play hard to get sometimes, but I can wait." I pulled away and finally, more forcefully, told him to leave me alone. His friendly demeanor instantly shifted into something darker, and I saw a flash of anger and menace cross his face. "You think you're too good for me," he whispered, his voice cold. "Because you're a passenger and I'm crew, you can treat me like I'm nothing." The threat was clear. I realized I was completely alone in that hall, with someone who knew my schedule, had access to my room, and was clearly unstable. I fought my way past him, got into my cabin, and slammed the door, locking it tight. Outside, I could still hear his laughter echoing in the corridor. Over the following days, Marco's behavior grew more disturbing, increasingly unpredictable, and I began to fear for my safety. He would appear wherever I had space on the ship, by the pool, in the dining hall, during the shows, always observing me from afar, yet making it obvious he was there. Each day when I returned to my cabin, I noticed my belongings had been disturbed in increasingly intimate ways. Toiletries were rearranged, and my clothes were handled in manners far beyond simple tidying. One day, I found a note slipped into my journal that simply said, "Soon," written in handwriting I didn't recognize. When I reported Marco to guest services, their response was disappointingly dismissive. The woman at the desk listened politely, but explained that crew members underwent thorough screening and that cultural differences could sometimes cause misunderstandings about appropriate behavior. She assured me they would speak with Marco about maintaining professional boundaries, but I got the sense they thought I was overreacting. That night, sleep proved elusive. I kept jumping at every hallway sound, double-checking my door lock. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a beep from my keycard reader, followed by the sound of someone trying to turn the handle. I froze as a stranger outside continued to try the door multiple times. Then I distinctly heard the swipe of a keycard again and again. The only thing preventing entry was the security latch I'd engaged from inside a barrier only someone already in the room could open. After about 10 minutes of sporadic attempts, I heard footsteps receding down the corridor. I didn't sleep at all thereafter, and first thing in the morning, I went straight to guest services, demanding to speak with security. This time, I was taken more seriously, especially when I recounted the midnight intrusion. Captain Rodriguez, the head of security, listened with growing concern. She explained that crew members carried master key cards capable of opening passenger cabins, but these were supposed to be used only in emergencies or for housekeeping during designated hours, with proper authorization. The fact that someone had tried to enter my room at 3 a.m. was a severe breach and deserved immediate investigation. Within an hour, Captain Rodriguez returned with troubling news. Confronted about the incident, Marco initially denied everything, but then admitted he was checking on me because he was worried about my safety as a solo female traveler. When they searched his quarters, they found photographs of me, taken without my knowledge by the pool, at dinner, walking around the ship. Even more disturbing, they discovered similar photos of other female passengers from previous cruises, along with what appeared to be stolen personal belongings, like jewelry and underwear. Marco was promptly confined to his quarters and would be handed over to authorities when we docked in Miami the next day. Captain Rodriguez assured me such incidents were extremely rare and said they would review their crew screening procedures to prevent future occurrences. She also offered to move me to a different cabin for my last night, but I just wanted to get off the ship as soon as possible. The experience shattered what was supposed to be a healing solo vacation, leaving me with a deep distrust of cruise travel altogether. What disturbed me most wasn't merely Marco's inappropriate behavior, but how easily he had accessed my private space and belongings without anyone noticing or caring. The thought that I had been sleeping in a room where a predator could enter at will gives me nightmares even now. I never took another cruise afterward. To this day, I can't stay in a hotel room without obsessively checking locks and security latches before I can relax enough to sleep. Back in November 2020, amidst the height of the pandemic, my husband David and I decided to embark on what we believed would be a peaceful 14-day transatlantic voyage from Miami to Southampton. We had both been working as essential responders throughout the worst of COVID. I'm an ICU nurse, and he's a paramedic, and desperately needed a break from months of relentless stress and trauma. The cruise line, Celebrity Eclipse, had implemented comprehensive health protocols, mandatory testing, reduced capacity, enhanced medical facilities that made us feel relatively safe traveling during such uncertain times. The ship could hold roughly 2,850 passengers at full capacity, but because of restrictions, we were sailing with only around 200 on board. This made every space feel almost luxurious, more privacy, shorter lines, more attentive service, a calm atmosphere that suited two exhausted healthcare workers who'd spent years on the front line. On our 6th day, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, about 800 meters from coast, everything took a terrible turn. We were dining at the ocean buffet when a commotion erupted at the far end. A man in his 60s, probably with his wife, suddenly collapsed while returning to his table with a plate of food. At first, it seemed like a faint or a stumble, but when David and I rushed over, instinct taking over, we instantly realized this was much worse. The man, whose name was Robert, was conscious but visibly distressed. He was gasping, his skin had turned a pallid gray, and he was clutching his chest in obvious pain. His wife, Patricia, knelt beside him, crying and asking what was happening. As an ICU nurse, I recognized the symptoms immediately. This was a massive heart attack. David began checking his vitals while I tried to soothe Patricia and keep Robert calm. Within minutes, the ship's medical team arrived, a doctor and 2 nurses who appeared surprisingly young and inexperienced. Dr. Martinez, the ship's doctor, was a quiet man, probably in his early 30s. As he examined Robert, I could see his concern growing. The ship's medical center on Deck 2 was functional, but limited, a small clinic with a handful of examination rooms, basic diagnostic equipment, and perhaps 6 beds. It was clear they were ill-equipped for such a critical cardiac emergency. As hours dragged on, Robert's condition worsened despite the efforts of the onboard medical staff. Patricia stayed close, her sobs filling the space. Dr. Martinez confided privately that Robert needed urgent cardiac catheterization and possibly surgery procedures impossible to perform at sea. The nearest major hospital was over 500 miles away, and even at maximum speed, it would take over 18 hours to reach it. The captain decided to divert the ship toward the Azores, which boasted the closest hospital capable of handling cardiac crises, but everyone understood time was running out. Dr. Martinez stayed in contact with shore-based specialists, trying to keep Robert stable with satellite guidance. But as night fell, it became painfully obvious that Robert's condition was slipping away fast. At 2 a.m., Patricia's screams shattered the ship's quiet. The man had gone into cardiac arrest. Despite the desperate resuscitation efforts, the ship lacked proper equipment, and the medical team was overwhelmed. I watched hopelessly through the window of the medical center as Dr. Martinez administered CPR more than 40 minutes, far beyond what would be normal in a hospital. His face etched with anguish, he fought a losing battle against both Robert's deteriorating condition and the ship's limited capabilities. Robert died at exactly 2:47 a.m., still over 300 miles from the nearest port. The heartbreaking sound Patricia made when Dr. Martinez finally ceased CPR, an animalistic, guttural cry, will stay with me forever. David and I remained with her through the tragic ordeal, tears streaming down our faces with hers, sharing that raw, devastating grief. As healthcare professionals, we had experienced loss before, but there was something especially heartbreaking about witnessing someone's death when you knew that a few hours' journey closer to land, in a proper hospital, he might have survived. The logistics of managing a death at sea layered the tragedy with an added dose of horror. The ship had a small morgue facility tucked away in the lower decks, where Robert's body would have to remain until we arrived at port. Patricia faced a nightmare scenario. Should she continue the cruise with her husband's body on board, or try to arrange an emergency evacuation, an undertaking that could cost tens of thousands of dollars, and still might be impossible depending on weather conditions and our location at sea? The cruise line offered to fly Patricia home from the Azores once we docked there, which was about 16 hours later, but she chose to stay with Robert's body and pressed on to Southampton, where she had family ready to help with arrangements. After Robert's death, the mood aboard the ship shifted drastically. Word spread quickly, and a somber silence permeated the crew and passengers alike. No amount of entertainment or distraction could lift the oppressive atmosphere. Dr. Martinez was visibly shaken, clearly traumatized by the ordeal. David and I spoke with him several times as the days passed, and he confided that this was his worst nightmare as a ship's doctor, seeing a patient who desperately needed advanced medical care that was simply unavailable. He'd been working on cruise ships for 5 years, mostly dealing with seasickness, minor injuries, and routine illnesses. But Robert's case had revealed the frightening reality of how vulnerable passengers are when they're days away from proper medical facilities. That experience fundamentally changed my perspective on cruise travel, especially for older passengers or those with pre-existing health issues. Most don't realize that the ship's medical facilities are essentially just emergency clinics with very limited capabilities. They're unequipped to handle serious cardiac events, strokes, complex traumas, or conditions requiring advanced diagnostics or surgical intervention. When you're lost in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest hospital, You're essentially gambling with your life, hoping nothing serious happens. Patricia kept in touch after the cruise and eventually filed a lawsuit against the cruise line, claiming they had misrepresented the level of medical care on board. Her lawyer argued that Robert might still be alive if the ship had been equipped with more advanced cardiac care equipment, or if a cardiac specialist had been aboard instead of just a general practitioner. The case was settled out of court, but it exposed the troubling gap between passengers' expectations of onboard medical services and the harsh reality of what's actually available when you're adrift in the vast ocean with no immediate help in sight. In October 2016, my partner Rachel and I decided to take a repositioning cruise from New York to Fort Lauderdale on the Norwegian Breakaway. We'd heard that these repositioning voyages offered a chance to enjoy luxury on the cheap, since cruise lines needed to move their ships from the Northeast to the Caribbean for the winter season. The 7-day trip down the Atlantic coast seemed perfect for a romantic getaway. At less than half the cost of a standard cruise, we couldn't resist. We envisioned a week filled with stunning ocean vistas, warm weather, and all the amenities of a massive floating resort without breaking the bank. The Norwegian Breakaway was an enormous vessel with over 4,000 passengers and crew, spanning 18 decks packed with restaurants, bars, theaters, and endless activities. Our cabin was on Deck 10, starboard side, with a balcony overlooking what we expected would be calm, blue Atlantic waters. The ship was decked out with every luxury imaginable: multiple pools, a rock-climbing wall, a go-kart track, Broadway-style shows, and more dining options than we could try in a month. As we sailed out of New York Harbor, past the Statue of Liberty on our first day, everything felt perfect. The October air was crisp but pleasant, the sea was calm, and we spent our time exploring the ship and marveling at this floating marvel of engineering. But by the second day, the atmosphere shifted ominously, and we realized we'd seriously misjudged the situation. The crew had been monitoring a weather system developing off the Carolinas, initially described as a minor tropical disturbance. But it quickly grew into something far more threatening. By the time we reached Atlantic City, the wind had intensified dramatically, and the gentle waves of the previous day had morphed into angry, towering rollers. The ship started rocking violently, making walking hazardous, and many passengers began complaining of seasickness. That evening, the captain announced over the intercom that we were experiencing what meteorologists now called a rapidly intensifying nor'easter, a massive storm directly in our path. His voice crackled through the speaker as he reassured us that the Norwegian Breakaway was built to withstand severe weather. He urged everyone to follow safety procedures and avoid the outer decks. What he didn't specify was that the storm's sustained winds exceeded 70 mm, with gusts reaching nearly 100 mm hurricane-force winds that would turn our tranquil cruise into a nightmare. By midnight, the ship was being thrown around like a toy in a storm bath. Rachel and I were in our cabin, desperately trying to sleep, when suddenly it seemed as if the entire vessel dropped several stories in a single deafening thud before slamming back down into the water. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard: metal groaning, water crashing, and an ear-splitting protest from the ship itself, fighting against the ferocious winds. Our balcony door, which we thought was tightly secured, burst open, unleashing a torrent of freezing seawater and hurricane-force winds into our room. The salt spray stung our faces as we scrambled to close it, managing to push the door shut just before several inches of water flooded our cabin, soaking everything we owned. Outside our door, the nightmare was even more evident. The corridors, once lively with vacationers, were now eerily deserted, aside from a few frantic passengers struggling to return to their rooms while clinging to handrails for stability. The elevators had been shut down for safety, trapping anyone not on their deck in whatever part of the ship they happened to be. Around 3:30 a.m., the ship began to list sharply to one side, causing loose objects and unsecured belongings to slide and crash across the floor. Fearful moments where it felt the vessel might capsize. Rachel begged me to tell her whether we were going to die, and I honestly had no answer. I'd never felt so small or helpless as I did in that storm, completely at the mercy of oceanic forces that made our colossal cruise ship seem insignificant. The worst hit came around 4 a.m., when we heard a loud explosion echo deep within the hull, followed by a grinding mechanical sound that signaled something had broken or failed. Our cabin's lights flickered and then went out entirely, leaving us in complete darkness, except for the emergency lighting along the hallways. Meanwhile, the ship's engines, which had kept us steady during the voyage, suddenly roared silent. We were left adrift, helpless in the storm, without power or propulsion. In the darkness, we listened to screams and frantic cries from elsewhere on the ship, others trapped, injured, or calling for help. Someone nearby was pounding on their door, shouting that they were stuck inside, their electronic locks rendered useless in the blackout. The corridors cast eerie shadows as we crawled along the floor, desperately holding on to anything nearby to find our way to safety. The crew did their best under unimaginable circumstances, but it was clear this storm far exceeded anyone's expectations. Fragmented emergency announcements crackled over the intercom, reporting injured passengers, flooding in lower decks, and structural damage. The medical center was overwhelmed with those hurt by falling debris or thrown against walls and furniture. Around 6 a.m., after what felt like an eternity of chaos, the emergency generators finally kicked in, restoring partial power and enabling the engines to restart, though with a strained, labored noise. At least we had some movement again. Captain Hansen's voice came on the speaker, this time tinged with genuine fear beneath his professional veneer, warning us that the situation was more serious than before, and that everyone should brace for what lay ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, our ship sustained some damage to its systems, but we're working diligently to restore everything to full operation. Please stay in your cabins unless there's an emergency. We're doing everything possible to navigate through the storm safely. As dawn broke, our first view of the ocean outside our cabin was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Waves towering at nearly 30 feet loomed over the ship like moving mountains of dark water. When the vessel crested these enormous swells, the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but furious, churned-up ocean for miles. Then, as the ship plunged into the troughs between waves, it felt as if we were at the bottom of a canyon, surrounded by walls of rising water, ready to crash down and crush us. The storm raged on for another 18 hours, during which several passengers were seriously injured and eventually had to be airlifted off the ship by Coast Guard helicopters once we neared the shore. The upper decks had suffered significant damage, deck furniture torn away and washed overboard, windows shattered, and part of the pool deck's overhang collapsed. On the lower decks, flooding wrecked passenger cabins, forcing dozens to be relocated elsewhere. When we finally reached Fort Lauderdale 2 days behind schedule, the Norwegian breakaway looked as if it had been through a war. Dents and scratches marked the hull, windows were broken, and twisted metal revealed where the storm had battered the ship's superstructure. The disembarking passengers looked shell-shocked and traumatized, many kissing the ground in relief after reaching solid land. That experience shifted my entire perspective on cruise travel, making me realize how quickly a tranquil vacation can turn into a fight for survival. Despite advanced technology and engineering, these massive ships remain just metal boxes floating on an indifferent ocean. The storm taught me that when you're hundreds of miles from land in the middle of the Atlantic, you're completely at the mercy of forces that can turn deadly without warning. I haven't taken another cruise since then. Every time I see glossy advertisements promising perfect weather and smooth sailing, I remember that night when our ship nearly tore itself apart in the darkness, and we prayed we'd survive until morning. Back in June 2018, my husband Eric and I decided to celebrate our 15th wedding anniversary with a 10-day Alaskan cruise aboard the Ocean Serenity. We'd always dreamed of seeing the glaciers and wildlife of the Inside Passage, and after years of saving, we finally splurged on a balcony cabin. A trip we hoped would be unforgettable. Eric had been working overtime for months to afford this, and I had used most of my vacation days from my job as a high school teacher. This was supposed to be our chance to reconnect and enjoy some quality time away from the stresses of daily life. The Ocean Serenity was a beautiful vessel, carrying around 2,150 passengers, with our cabin on Deck 7 offering a perfect view of the ocean we'd sail through on our way to Alaska. The ship's elegant, refined atmosphere felt more upscale than the party-focused cruises we'd been on before. Most of the passengers appeared to be couples our age or older, retirees with the time and resources for longer, more costly voyages. For the first few days, as we headed north along the Canadian coast, everything was exactly as we'd hoped. Stunning scenery, excellent cuisine, and the peaceful, romantic ambiance that had been missing from our marriage for too long. It was on the third day at sea, during lunch at the Ocean View Buffet, that we encountered the Hendersons. They sat at the table next to ours, a couple in their early 60s who seemed fairly pleasant at first glance. The man, Dale, was tall and heavyset, with gray hair and a booming voice that carried across the dining hall. His wife, Susan, was smaller, quieter, with nervous eyes that rarely met ours when she spoke. They struck up a conversation, asking us where we were from and about our planned excursions, typical small talk on a cruise where you share dining spaces with strangers day after day. Dale appeared friendly, maybe a little eager, but it was Susan's behavior that set my nerves on edge. She kept staring at me with a disturbing intensity, studying my face, hair, clothes, as if memorizing every detail. When I caught her watching, she wouldn't look away. Instead, she would smile narrowly, that didn't reach her eyes, and keep staring. During our chat, she asked unusually personal questions about our marriage, jobs, and whether we had children. When I mentioned we'd been trying to conceive for several years without success, I noticed a shift in her expression, an unsettling change that made my skin crawl. After lunch, we assumed that would be the end of our interactions with the Hendersons. But over the next few days, they seemed to appear wherever we went. They'd often end up seated right behind us during the evening show or across from us by the pool. Even at dinners at specialty restaurants, we'd find them nearby. Susan maintaining her unnerving habit of staring at me throughout the entire meal. Eric initially dismissed my discomfort, saying ships weren't that large and it was natural to see familiar faces repeatedly. However, even he began to notice how often the Hendersons seemed to be around us. Things took a sharp turn on day 5 when we docked in Juneau. We had planned a whale-watching tour for the day, a chance to get off the ship and experience Alaska's remarkable wildlife. Waiting in line for the bus, Susan suddenly approached me while Eric was chatting with the guide. She moved uncomfortably close, close enough that I could smell her heavy perfume and see a strange gleam in her eyes. In a whisper, she said, "You remind me so much of my daughter." Her voice was soft but unsettling. She'd be about your age now if she were alive. Oh, the way she said it, accompanied by a disconcerting smile, made me take a step back. Before I could respond, she pressed on. "She had your hair color, your build. Often, I watch you from across the room, and I forget for a moment that you're not her." The implication that she was watching me closely enough to imagine I was her deceased daughter was utterly disturbing. I was at a loss for words. When Eric returned, Susan immediately shifted back to normal conversation, asking about our whale tour as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop fixating on her words and the strange, possessive look in her eyes. That night I confided in Eric, and he finally agreed that their behavior was becoming intrusive. We resolved to avoid them as much as possible for the remainder of the cruise, but staying away from someone who seems to actively pursue you on a ship that large proved almost impossible. The following morning at breakfast, Dale and Susan were already seated at a table directly facing the entrance like they'd been waiting for us. Dale waved us over enthusiastically, and before we could decline, Susan patted the empty chair next to her, insisting I sit beside her. Throughout the meal, she kept touching my arm, playing with my hair, and making bizarre comments about how much I resembled her Angel, presumably her late daughter. Her touches intensified. She would hug me, brush off imaginary lint, or hold my hand while talking. When I tried to pull away, she would tighten her grip, whispering, "Don't be shy, sweetie. Mommy just wants to love you." The way she said, "Mommy," gazing into my eyes with that unhinged expression, made me feel physically ill. Eric could see how distressed I was and tried to intervene, but Dale would quickly divert his attention with loud discussions about sports or politics, deliberately keeping us apart so Susan could continue her intrusive behavior. The situation finally exploded on the 7th day as we cruised through Glacier Bay. Early that morning, Eric and I stood on our balcony, watching the sunrise over the majestic glaciers, a breathtaking sight, one of the most beautiful moments we'd ever shared. Standing there in our pajamas, stealing a quiet moment with coffee in hand, we suddenly heard a noise from the balcony next door. To our horror, Dale was standing on his balcony, binoculars in hand, watching us with an intensity that sent chills down our spines. "Morning, neighbors," he called out cheerfully, as if spying on fellow passengers with binoculars was perfectly normal. "Beautiful sunrise, isn't it? Susan and I love watching you two lovebirds enjoy your romantic moments. You remind us so much of when we were young and in love." The implications, what those words revealed about their voyeuristic obsession, were utterly horrifying. Before we could respond, Susan appeared beside Dale. When she saw me in my pajamas, her face lit up with an expression that was both maternal and predatory. "Oh, honey," she called out. "You look so beautiful in the morning light, just like my daughter used to look. Would you mind if I took some pictures to remember this special time we've shared, just so I can hold on to it?" The notion of this clearly unstable woman capturing images of me in my nightwear while comparing me to her deceased daughter was so unsettling that I immediately retreated inside and locked the balcony door. That afternoon, we went to guest services to report the Hendersons' behavior, but the response was frustratingly inadequate. The staff member listened politely, but explained that, as long as the Hendersons weren't making threats or physically attacking anyone, there was little they could do. Apparently, being creepy and inappropriate wasn't enough to warrant removal from the ship. And with us in the remote Alaskan wilderness for the next 2 days, with no ports to disembark, even if they wanted to remove the Hendersons, there was nowhere to take them. The situation reached its horrifying peak on our 8th night, during the formal dinner service in the main dining room. Despite requesting a table far from where we'd seen the Hendersons sitting earlier in the trip, they had somehow been seated directly across from us. Throughout the meal, Susan fixated on me with an expression that had transitioned from unsettling to genuinely menacing. Midway through dinner, she excused herself to go to the bathroom, and a few minutes later, I felt the same urge. Mike offered to accompany me, but I insisted I'd be fine, something I would come to deeply regret. When I entered the women's restroom, Susan was waiting inside, standing by the sinks, with that same unhinged smile that had haunted me for days. "Finally, we can have some alone time," she said, blocking the door. "I've been waiting so long to tell you how much you mean to me, how much you remind me of my precious daughter. She died in a car accident 5 years ago, and meeting you feels like getting a piece of her back." As she spoke, she stepped closer, trembling hands reaching out to brush my face with an emotion that seemed overwhelming and unstable. "I know this might sound crazy," she continued, voice rising in panic. "But I've been thinking maybe this isn't just coincidence. Maybe God brought you to me because He knows how much I miss her. Maybe you could come home with us after the cruise. We have her room just as she left it, her clothes, her makeup, everything. You could be our daughter now. We could be a family again." The desperation and delusion in her voice were terrifying. I realized I was trapped with someone clearly slipping into a psychotic break. I pushed past her and fled back to the dining room, grabbing Mike and urgently telling him we had to leave immediately. We spent the remainder of the cruise hiding in our cabin, ordering room service, and avoiding all public areas where the Hendersons might find us. Even so, we could occasionally hear knocks on our door. Susan's voice calling softly, "Sweetie, please don't hide from Mommy," in a sing-song tone that haunted both of us. When we finally disembarked in Seattle, we saw the Hendersons one last time at the terminal. Susan was crying hysterically while Dale tried to comfort her. As we hurried past with our luggage, I overheard her sobbing about how she had finally found her daughter, only to be losing her again. The entire experience turned what was meant to be a romantic anniversary cruise into a nightmare of psychological torment, leaving us traumatized and questioning whether we'd ever feel safe traveling again. I learned then that some of the most dangerous individuals are not necessarily criminals or predators in the traditional sense, but those who are so broken by grief and loss that reality itself has become distorted, blurring the line between sanity and delusion, especially in the confined, strangers-locked environment of a cruise ship, where days or weeks pass with no escape, and you have no idea what invisible burdens your fellow travelers carry. When their mental instability turns inward, targeting you as the solution to their pain, escape feels impossible. Back in February 2021, my college roommate Jessica and I decided to take a girls' trip to celebrate both of us finally getting our COVID-19 vaccinations and the world starting to feel somewhat normal again. After nearly a year of lockdown working from home, rarely seeing anyone outside our immediate families, we jumped at the chance when cruise lines resumed sailing with reduced capacity and heightened safety measures. We booked a 7-day Western Caribbean cruise aboard the Royal Caribbean Symphony of the Seas, eager for sunshine, drinks, and a chance to reclaim our sanity after one of the most stressful years of our lives. The Symphony of the Seas was an enormous vessel, normally carrying over 6,000 passengers and crew, but during that cruise, operating at about 40 capacity due to pandemic restrictions. This meant access to the ship's incredible amenities, multiple pools, rock climbing walls, surf simulators, ice skating rinks, Broadway productions, yet with far fewer crowds. Our interior cabin on Deck 8 was cozy but adequate, with twin beds, a tiny bathroom, just enough space for our luggage. We chose an interior room to save money, planning to spend most of our time exploring or soaking up the Caribbean sun rather than hanging out in the room. The first few days were idyllic. We lounged by the pools, sampled myriad restaurants, attended lively evening shows, and caught up on all the time we'd lost during the pandemic's worst. With fewer passengers, we easily grabbed chairs, and the generally relaxed atmosphere made everything feel more luxurious and open. We met fellow travelers our age celebrating their return to normal life, and the mood on board was one of relief and excitement. Finally, travel was possible again. But on our fourth night docked in Costa Maya, Mexico, our perfect vacation suddenly turned terrifying. Jessica and I had spent the day exploring the port, browsing for souvenirs, and drinking too many margaritas at a beachfront bar. By the time we returned to the ship around 10 p.m., we were exhausted and slightly tipsy, ready to collapse into our cabin and sleep off the day's adventures. We fumbled with our key card, laughing about some silly moment from our shore excursion. As we finally opened the door and stepped inside, I immediately noticed a strange smell. Musky, masculine cologne that hadn't been there earlier. The second thing I observed was that our belongings had been disturbed. Clothes strewn around the room in a carefree way earlier were now meticulously rearranged. More unsettling, our swimsuits and underwear, previously mixed with our other clothes, were now laid out separately on Jessica's bed, as though someone had deliberately organized them. "Did housekeeping come by today?" Jessica asked, but we both knew that wasn't possible. Housekeeping had already cleaned earlier in the day, and even the most thorough staff wouldn't bother sorting through our personal items and arranging them so precisely. As we scrutinized the room, clearer signs of intrusion emerged. Our toiletries had been moved, our suitcases searched through, and our phones, left charging on the nightstand, were now unplugged and repositioned. The most chilling discovery was when Jessica opened her laptop. Her browser history, which she'd cleared that morning, now showed evidence that someone had been exploring her social media, her photos, and her emails. "Someone's been in here," she whispered, eyes fixed on the screen. "This is seriously creepy. They went through my private stuff, looked at everything. Who does that?" We immediately contacted guest services to report the intrusion, but their response was dismissive. The young woman on the other end explained that crew members had master access for safety and maintenance, and passengers often misremembered where they'd left their belongings. When we pressed that this was beyond mere forgetfulness, she offered to send security. The officer who arrived, Officer Martinez, was sympathetic but realistic. He listened carefully, then explained that with thousands of crew members having access, it was virtually impossible to determine who had entered our cabin or confirm anything inappropriate had occurred. He offered to change our cabin locks or move us to another room. Unfortunately, all similar rooms were now occupied, and the only options were much pricier suites. We decided to stay put, but resolved to take precautions we'd never imagined on a cruise, knowing someone might have crossed boundaries that should never be breached. We began taking our valuables, electronics, and personal belongings with us every time we left the cabin, no matter how brief the trip to grab ice or a snack. We arranged our items in specific patterns to detect any movement and started photographing everything before leaving, hoping to gather evidence if anything was disturbed again. Unfortunately, these precautions proved futile. The next day, while we were dining in the main mess hall, someone entered our cabin once more. This intruder had become bolder, clearly unconcerned about us noticing. Our laundry, which we'd left in a pile near the bathroom, had been rummaged through. Our underwear and bras separated out, and shockingly, several pairs were missing entirely. These were items we were sure we had packed and worn earlier during the cruise. The violation felt deeply personal and terrifying. The thought that someone was collecting our intimate clothing as trophies was nauseating. What made matters worse was that despite our complaints to security, the intruder still entered our cabin, making us feel utterly powerless. We were stuck on this ship for 3 more days, with someone who clearly had access and was using it for disturbing purposes. That evening, Jessica, fueled by desperation and a little liquid courage, proposed a risky plan. We would pretend to head to dinner as usual, but one of us would hide in the bathroom while the other went to eat, hoping to catch the intruder in the act. It was a dangerous gamble that could have put whoever was hiding in harm's way, but our frustration with the security's inaction left us no other choice. I volunteered to stay hidden, and after Jessica left for dinner, I slipped into the tiny bathroom, leaving the door ajar just enough to peek into the main cabin. At first, nothing happened, and I began to think perhaps the intruder had moved on, targeting other passengers instead. But around 8:30 p.m., I heard the unmistakable beep of a key card unlocking our door. I braced myself, expecting perhaps a crew member, but what entered was not staff. It was a passenger, a man probably in his mid-50s, dressed in khaki shorts and a polo shirt that reeked of middle-aged tourist. He carried a small bag and moved through our space with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. I watched in horror as he headed straight for our laundry pile, scooped up several of our underwear, and shoved them into his bag. Then he rifled through our suitcases, scrutinizing each piece of clean clothing before snatching a few more items. The most disturbing part was how casual, how methodical he was. This wasn't impulsive theft, but a practiced routine. He knew exactly what he was looking for and how to find it quickly. I saw him even snap photos of some belongings with his phone, including pictures of our IDs and credit cards left on the nightstand, which we'd been careless enough to leave in plain sight. I froze, trapped in the bathroom, watching this invasion of our privacy, unsure whether to confront him or wait for him to leave so I could alert security afterward. The man was larger than me, and we were alone in the cabin. There was no telling if he might react violently if cornered. I decided to stay hidden and gather as much information as possible, hoping it would help identify him later. After roughly 10 minutes of rummaging, he prepared to leave, but not before pulling out a small notepad and scribbling something down. He left the note nestled on Jessica's pillow, then used his own key card, somehow. He had a master key card that opened our door, casually slipping out as he had entered. As soon as I heard the door click shut, I called Jessica back to the cabin, urging her to return immediately, and then contacted security to report what I'd seen. The note he left was even more disturbing than the theft. It detailed our daily routines, shore excursions, and personal information evidence that he had stalked us throughout the cruise. It ended with a phone number and the chilling message, "Call me when you want to have some real fun." When security finally arrived, they took the situation more seriously. Officer Martinez brought additional personnel and reviewed hallway security footage to find the intruder. Within 2 hours, they identified him as Robert Chen, a 52-year-old from California traveling alone. It emerged that he had been targeting multiple female passengers throughout the cruise. When they searched his cabin, they discovered stolen underwear from at least 6 women, along with notes about passenger routines and photos taken without consent. The shocking part was how Chen had gained access to our room. He'd bribed a crew member in housekeeping to supply him with master key cards and information about when cabins would be vacant. The crew member was immediately fired and handed over to authorities when we docked, revealing that she had been providing Chen access on multiple voyages for several $100s a day. Chen was confined to his cabin for the rest of the cruise and was arrested by FBI agents once we arrived in Miami. Later investigations uncovered that he had been operating in this manner on several ships over the past 2 years, and our case helped link him to similar incidents elsewhere. The cruise line offered us a full refund and a complimentary future voyage, but neither of us had any desire to ever step on a cruise ship again. The experience shattered my sense of safety when traveling and opened my eyes to how vulnerable passengers are to both fellow travelers and crew members with hidden agendas. The fact that someone could access our private space, plunder our belongings for days, and do so unnoticed highlighted the glaring security flaws on these floating cities, where thousands of strangers are confined together for days on end. Since then, every hotel room I stay in feels like a potential crime scene. I now travel equipped with alarms, hidden cameras, and obsessive security measures I never needed before that nightmare cruise. In September 2019, my brother Tom and I decided to take our first boys' trip since college, a celebration of his recent promotion to senior partner at his law firm. After a tough year of divorces, we desperately needed something to remind us that life could still be fun and adventurous. Tom, the responsible older brother, had always worked relentless hours, rarely taking time for himself. So, when he suggested a 12-day transatlantic voyage from Southampton to New York aboard the Queen Mary II, I was taken aback but quickly agreed. Spending nearly 2 weeks crossing the Atlantic on one of the world's most renowned ocean liners seemed the perfect escape to disconnect from worries and reconnect as brothers. The Queen Mary 2 was everything you'd expect from Cunard's flagship, elegant, refined, steeped in maritime history. Unlike the modern theme park-style cruise ships, this was a true ocean liner, built for serious transatlantic crossings in style and comfort. About 2,600 passengers traveled on board, designed to evoke the grandeur of Golden Age ocean travel. Our stateroom on Deck 6 was luxuriously appointed, with dark wood paneling, tasteful furnishings, and a porthole offering views of the vast North Atlantic. The first few days, as we sailed away from England into increasingly turbulent waters, everything felt perfect. Formal dinners, afternoon tea, lectures by guest speakers, a refined atmosphere that made us feel like part of history. Built in 2003 with modern safety features, the ship had redundancies like backup generators, advanced fire suppression, satellite communication, and enough lifeboats to handle twice the passenger capacity. Captain Williams, with over 3 decades of Atlantic sailing experience, provided daily updates on our progress and weather conditions. His calm professionalism reassured us that we were in expert hands for the 6-day voyage across the ocean. But around the 4th day, somewhere in the heart of the Atlantic and 1,000 miles from land, we began to sense something was wrong. Tom and I were having lunch in the Britannia restaurant when the lights flickered several times in quick succession. The brief flashes, just a second or two each, caused everyone to pause and look up confused, eyes fixed on the elaborate chandeliers. The staff continued serving seamlessly, but concern flickered in their eyes as they exchanged uneasy glances. About an hour later, during a lecture in the ship's planetarium, the lights flickered again, this time accompanied by a subtle, yet unmistakable change in the engine sounds. The steady hum of the ship's engines, our constant companion, faltered into an irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat with skipped beats, making us all increasingly uneasy. The marine biologist leading a lecture on whale migration paused suddenly, listening intently to the engine noise with a frown before resuming his talk. It was clear he was distracted by whatever he was hearing. That evening at dinner, Captain Evans announced over the ship's intercom that would forever alter my life. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice crackled with a seriousness I'd never heard before, "we are experiencing minor technical difficulties with one of our main electrical systems. Our engineering team is working to fix the issue, but as a precaution, there may be intermittent power fluctuations over the next few hours. I want to reassure everyone that safety systems are fully operational and there's no cause for alarm." But alarm was precisely what we should have felt. It quickly became apparent that the captain was minimizing the situation. Throughout dinner, the lights flickered unpredictably, and the air conditioning began cycling on and off, creating patches of stifling heat contrasted by icy cold in different parts of the ship. The elevator systems malfunctioned, trapping passengers between floors for minutes at a stretch, only to jerk back to life with grinding noises that betrayed deeper issues in the ship's power network. By 10 p.m., while Tom and I sipped drinks in the Commodore lounge, the crisis escalated violently. Without warning, half the ship was enveloped in darkness. The once lively space, brightly lit and buzzing with conversation just moments before, transformed into an ominous cavern, shadows flickering eerily under the emergency lighting. The ship's engines, which had been sputtering all day with irregular rhythm, suddenly fell silent, leaving us adrift and powerless in the vast Atlantic. In the oppressive darkness, I could hear crew members rushing through the corridors, shouting instructions in unfamiliar languages. Emergency announcements crackled over the intercom, but incessant power failures caused them to cut off mid-sentence, leaving us to fill in the gaps with our worst fears. "Attention passengers, we have lost all main power. Engineering teams are on site. Please remain calm and follow safety instructions." The silence where the engine's roar should have been was the most chilling sound I'd ever encountered. On a ship in the middle of the ocean, those engines do more than propel us. They sustain life. They power the lights, air circulation, water pumps, navigation, and communication systems. Everything keeping 2,600 lives alive amid one of Earth's deadliest waters. Without power, the Queen Mary II was nothing but a floating coffin at the mercy of the Atlantic currents. Tom, who was usually unshakable in crises, gripped my arm tightly. "This is bad," he whispered, his voice low, yet heavy with unspoken dread. His words carried more weight than any heroic speech could muster. Around us, the mood was unraveling. Passengers began to panic, some crying quietly, while others demanding answers from crew members who clearly had none. The temperature plummeted as failing heating systems compounded our misery, casting everything in a sinister red glow from the emergency lights, an unsettling tableau that resembled scenes from a horror film. We heard banging, shouting from below decks, where the engineering crew was desperately attempting to repair the power. But as hours dragged on with no resolution, it became obvious that this was no ordinary mechanical glitch that could be fixed quickly. At 2 a.m., Captain Evans made another announcement, this time with brutal honesty. "We have experienced a complete failure of our primary electrical generation, and our backup generators have also failed. We are now running on emergency batteries, which will last about 18 hours. Our engineers are working tirelessly to restore power, but I must also inform you that we've sent out a distress call to nearby vessels requesting assistance." Those words hit me like a blow. We were over 1,000 miles from the nearest port, drifting helplessly with limited power that might not last. The captain's admission that repair might be impossible sent a wave of dread through the ship. If they couldn't restore the main systems within those 18 hours, we would be left in darkness, without heat, air, or a way to contact the outside world. It was a nightmare of status deterioration, and it soon came true. In the next 16 hours, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The ship's water pumps failed, leaving us without drinking water or means to maintain sanitation. Waste systems broke down, creating unsanitary conditions that worsened with each passing hour. Cold Atlantic air seeped through the hull, dragging temperatures down as passengers bundled into their clothes, huddling together for warmth. Cooking and food service became impossible. The crew distributed whatever emergency supplies they could find, but with no hot meals or heating, hunger and dehydration became dire issues. Most terrifying of all was the complete communication blackout. Without satellite power, we had no way to contact rescue teams or update loved ones ashore. To the outside world, we vanished into the abyss. As the battery's final 2 hours dwindled, the engineering crew managed to get one backup generator partially operational, just enough to restore minimal lighting, essential life support, and vital communication equipment. Captain Evans immediately reached out to the Coast Guard and nearby ships, requesting emergency aid and supplies. Over the next 4 days, 3 vessels converged on our position, bringing power generators, provisions, and the expertise needed to repair our failing systems. It was a grueling ordeal, with non-stop efforts from engineers on each ship. By the 5th day, after nearly a week of struggle, the Queen Mary II's systems finally stabilized enough to steer into New York Harbor under our own power, 5 days late and forever scarred by the experience. An investigation later revealed that a cascading electrical failure caused by a design flaw in the ship's power management had knocked out both primary and backup systems, leaving us entirely dependent on emergency batteries not built for such an ordeal. This terrifying episode forever changed my view of ocean travel. It made me acutely aware of how fragile these giant ships are, dependent on complex systems that can fail in ways leaving thousands stranded and helpless in the vast, indifferent ocean. Every time I see advertisements promising relaxing cruises, I recall those harrowing hours of powerless drift, remembering that nature's fury and mechanical failure do not care about human ingenuity or confidence. Back in July 2015, my wife Karen and I decided to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary with a second honeymoon cruise. We'd married young, dedicated the first decade to careers and buying our first home, and never truly indulged in the romantic vacation we'd always dreamed of. We booked a 14-day Mediterranean voyage aboard the MSC Splendida, planning to visit Italy, Spain, Greece, and France, while enjoying the luxury amenities of a vessel that carried over 4,000 passengers and crew. Karen had been counting down the months, researching ports, and making detailed itineraries to see every sight and experience possible. The MSC Splendida was an absolutely stunning ship, with elegant Italian design accentuated by multiple pools, restaurants, and entertainment venues across 18 decks. Our cabin on Deck 11 with a balcony provided an unobstructed view of the Mediterranean, and during the first few days, we simply marveled at the deep blue waters and stunning sunsets that we watched from our private terrace. The ship radiated a lively international vibe, filled with passengers from dozens of countries, while the crew's warm Italian hospitality made everyone feel like special guests rather than just paying vacationers. Karen was in her element. She captured every scene on camera, sampled new dishes, and struck up conversations with other travelers at our assigned dining table. It wasn't until our 6th day, sailing between the Greek islands over relatively placid seas, that our idyllic trip suddenly turned into a nightmare that haunts me to this day, 8 years later. After exploring Santorini that afternoon and returning to the ship around 6 p.m., we were both exhausted, yet content. We had spent the day hiking through the island's volcanic landscapes and decided on a quiet dinner on our balcony with room service, watching the sunset over the Aegean while sharing a bottle of wine and talking about how this was the romantic evening we'd been craving in all our busy lives. As the clock approached 9 p.m., Karen said she wanted to take photos of the ship's wake under the moonlight. The sea was incredibly calm, with just a gentle swell that made the ship sway slightly through the night. Karen went to the very edge of our balcony, trying to get the perfect shot, capturing both the reflection of the ship's lights on the water and the moon's trail across the shadowy sea. I was inside rinsing our dinner dishes and preparing for bed when I heard a sound that would haunt me forever. A brief, terrified scream, followed by a splash that seemed impossibly far beneath us. I rushed onto the balcony, but Karen was gone. The railing she'd been leaning against was still there, and her camera rested on the deck chair where she'd left it. But my wife had vanished into the dark, endless Mediterranean night. At first, I couldn't process what had happened. People don't just disappear from cruise ship balconies, I told myself. There must be some logical explanation. Maybe she had gone back inside through the other door. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Maybe it was all an illusion, I thought. But as I called her name and searched every corner of our small cabin, the horrifying truth sank in. Karen had fallen overboard, and she was likely somewhere behind us in the darkness, probably already hundreds of yards away, as the giant ship continued its journey through the night. I started screaming for help and pounding on the cabin walls, desperate to alert anyone who might hear me. Within minutes, I was on the phone with guest services, barely able to form coherent sentences, as I explained that my wife had fallen overboard and insisted they stop the ship immediately. The representative, a woman with a thick Italian accent, kept telling me to calm down and repeat what I'd said, as if the idea of someone falling into the sea from a cruise ship was beyond comprehension. After what felt like hours, though it was only about 10 minutes, ship security arrived at our cabin, along with several officers, including the captain himself. Captain Romano, a serious man in his early 50s, listened carefully to my account with a composed professionalism, but I saw the concern in his eyes as I recounted the details. Within moments, he ordered the ship to execute a Williamson turn, a swift maneuver designed to bring the vessel back to the exact spot where someone had fallen overboard as quickly as possible. The sudden change in course and speed was surreal. The MSC Splendida, which had been cruising steadily through calm waters just moments earlier, now performed a broad, sweeping turn, while crew members everywhere sprang into action with practiced efficiency, as if they'd prepared for this scenario countless times. Emergency lights flickered on throughout the ship. Search teams deployed powerful spotlights, infrared cameras, rescue gear, and even a helicopter summoned from a nearby Greek island. All passengers were instructed through announcements to stay in their cabins as the crew launched their emergency operations. Despite the earnest efforts, I knew we faced almost impossible odds. Karen had been in the water for at least 20 minutes by the time the search began. Nighttime in the vast, dark ocean was unforgiving. A single person was nearly invisible unless caught in the beam of a searchlight. The calm, picturesque Mediterranean from the deck disguises a vast and perilous wilderness when alone in the darkness. Survival was measured in hours, at best. The operation was the most frantic, heartbreaking effort I have ever borne witness to. Every piece of rescue equipment was deployed, powerful searchlights illuminating hundreds of meters, infrared cameras detecting heat signatures, rescue rafts with crews, and even a helicopter from the Greek island to aid in the search. Yet finding one person in thousands of square miles of open water at night was akin to searching for a tiny grain of sand on a sprawling beach. Commotion would erupt every few minutes, shouts that they'd spotted something, only to find a piece of seaweed, moonlight shimmering on the waves, or debris drifting by. As hours dragged on, the truth grew more despairing. Karen had been dressed in a light dress and sandals, the kind of clothing offering no warmth or protection against the surprisingly cold night in the sea. Even if she had been an expert swimmer, hypothermia would set in within an hour. After 2 or 3 hours in the water, her chances of survival were virtually non-existent. The crew fought tirelessly, but the strain was obvious on their faces. They knew the odds. Around 4 a.m., after 7 hours of relentless searching, Captain Romano made a decision I'd hoped never to face. The search was over. They had scoured every possible drift path based on currents and wind, and continuing was futile. The helicopter had been grounded after exhausting its fuel. Rescue teams were pulled back on board, and the MSC Splendida gradually resumed its course toward our next port. That moment, the official declaration that my wife was gone, was utterly devastating. It was a heartbreaking acceptance that Karen, the woman I'd shared 10 years of my life with, had simply vanished into that dark, indifferent sea. The ship, which had been our floating paradise mere hours before, suddenly felt like a prison. Surrounded by thousands of smiling vacationers enjoying carefree moments, I was trapped by grief, trying to grasp the reality that she was gone forever. The crew, to their credit, did everything possible to support me, offering grief counseling, helping me contact both her family and mine, and arranging for me to disembark at the next port so I could fly home and begin the long, painful process of rebuilding. But the investigation into how she fell revealed an even more heartbreaking detail. The balcony railing on our cabin, which should have been 42 inches high according to safety standards, was actually only 39 inches because of a construction defect left unnoticed for years. Karen, standing at 5'8", leaning over to take her photographs, was vulnerable. The lower-than-regulation railing combined with the ship's gentle rocking was enough to send her over the edge. The cruise line eventually settled a lawsuit out of court for an undisclosed amount, but no financial compensation could restore the woman who had been so excited to photograph the Mediterranean moonlight. That night marred my ability to find joy in travel or anything else for years. Every time I see advertisements showcasing couples enjoying romantic balcony dinners, I think of how swiftly paradise can turn into hell and how the ocean shows no mercy for dreams or plans. Karen fell into the sea that appeared serene from our balcony, but once she was in it, the dark, cold water became her grave. The Mediterranean claimed my wife and offered nothing but the echo of her frantic scream and that impulsive splash which changed everything in an instant. Back in April 2014, my mother-in-law Dorothy insisted we all go on a cruise to celebrate her 70th birthday. She had spent over a year planning this trip, eager to gather her 3 children, their spouses, and her 6 grandchildren for what she called a proper family getaway. We booked a 10-day Eastern Caribbean voyage aboard the Carnival Liberty, with 14 family members ranging from 8 to 70 years old, staying in adjoining cabins on Deck 6. Dorothy was so eager for everyone to be together that she had meticulously researched every restaurant, activity, and shore excursion, creating detailed plans to make sure we all enjoyed what she called her dream vacation. The Carnival Liberty embodied what you'd expect from a carnival ship, bright, lively, and designed for family fun. With over 3,000 passengers on board, the ship was constantly bustling. Kids darted around the pool decks, grandparents tried their luck in the casino, and everywhere you looked, there was a sense of non-stop activity. The dining options seemed endless. Multiple buffets, specialty restaurants, 24-hour room service, and snack bars scattered across every deck. Dorothy was in her element, eagerly taking photos of the family sampling different foods, watching the evening shows together, and hoping these moments would turn into lifelong memories. For the first 4 days, everything went exactly as Dorothy envisioned. Every evening, we gathered at the designated family table in the main dining room. During the days, we relaxed by the pool, while the children played in the water and explored the ports of St. Thomas and St. Martin as one big, happy group. Dorothy kept saying it was the best week of her life, watching her children and grandchildren connect in ways that rarely happened during our usual holiday gatherings back home. The ship's buffets quickly became our favorite spot, especially the Sea Day brunch on Deck 9, where we'd meet each morning to plan our day's adventures. Stacks of eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, and pastries on our plates. It was on the 5th morning, as we made our way toward Barbados, that everything shifted into a terrifying nightmare. We had our usual buffet breakfast around 9 a.m., and Dorothy was particularly excited because she'd heard the chef was preparing a special seafood presentation featuring fresh catches from the Caribbean. The buffet looked stunning. Dozens of beautifully arranged seafood salads, exotic fruits, and elaborate desserts that drew crowds of camera-wielding passengers. We all piled our plates high, Dorothy insisting we try her recommended crab salad, claiming it looked absolutely divine. 3 hours later, while lounging beside the pool, my 8-year-old nephew Tyler started complaining of stomach pain. Within moments, he was vomiting violently over his pool chair, ejecting everything he'd eaten at breakfast in a fit of uncontrollable retching. The scene quickly drew attention from fellow passengers and pool deck staff. Before we could get him cleaned up and back to his cabin, my sister-in-law Jennifer began experiencing the same symptoms, followed soon after by Dorothy herself, who became so violently ill she could hardly stand. By 2 p.m., 10 of our 14 family members were suffering from severe food poisoning, violent vomiting, explosive diarrhea, fever, and intense abdominal cramps that left them writhing in agony in their cabins. The ship's medical center, designed for minor injuries and routine illness, was overwhelmed almost immediately. The outbreak wasn't limited to our family. Dozens of other passengers had also eaten from that contaminated buffet. The meager team of 2 doctors and 3 nurses was unable to handle the surge. Dr. Peterson, the ship's chief physician, was experienced in typical cruise ship ailments, but had never faced an outbreak of this magnitude. By nightfall, over 200 passengers showed symptoms consistent with severe food poisoning, and the numbers kept climbing. The medical facilities, which had seemed sufficient at first, quickly became overwhelmed as sick passengers lined the halls outside the medical center, many too weak to stand. Dorothy, once the most enthusiastic about the cruise, became one of the worst patients. At 70, her frail body couldn't cope with the dehydration and electrolyte imbalances caused by relentless vomiting and diarrhea. We watched helplessly as she deteriorated, her vibrant energy replaced by a ghostly pallor lying in her cabin, connected to an IV after her third visit to the overwhelmed medical center. Seeing her there, struggling to breathe, while the sounds of other family members being violently sick echoed through neighboring cabins, was heartbreaking. Despite efforts to contain it by closing the buffets and increasing sanitation protocols, the outbreak had already spread. Contaminated seafood had infiltrated the ship's entire food system. Passengers who ate in the main dining rooms, ordered room service, or simply grabbed snacks from the pool deck were falling ill at an alarming rate. By the second day, more than 500 passengers, nearly 1/16 of everyone on board, were experiencing symptoms that ranged from mild nausea to severe dehydration, requiring urgent medical care. The once cheerful atmosphere turned eerily tense, broken only by frequent announcements about cleaning procedures and the hurried movement of medical personnel trying to tend to an overwhelming number of patients. The ship transformed into a makeshift hospital. The hallways reeked of disinfectant mixed with vomit. Passengers, pale and weak, looked around in fear, anxious about their health and their disrupted vacation. The crisis reached its peak on the third day when Dorothy went into septic shock from severe dehydration and bacterial infection ravaging her system. Her blood pressure plummeted, her kidneys began failing, and Dr. Peterson made the difficult call for an emergency evacuation. A Coast Guard helicopter was dispatched while we were still 200 miles from the nearest port. We watched in silent terror as Dorothy was strapped onto a stretcher and winched into the helicopter, rushing her toward a hospital in Puerto Rico. Our family was left behind, too sick and worried about Dorothy's condition to enjoy the remaining days of the cruise. The ship had been turned into a floating hospital, with CDC medical personnel flown in to assist with investigations and additional treatment. It was eventually determined that the outbreak originated from improperly stored seafood in the ship's main galley. The contaminated crab salad, Dorothy's beloved dish, had been tainted with salmonella and other dangerous bacteria, which then spread through cross-contamination to other food prep areas. When we finally docked in Fort Lauderdale, over 600 passengers and 150 crew members had been affected. The ship was immediately quarantined for thorough sanitization, and everyone was medically screened before disembarkation. Our family was among the last to leave, as several members remained too weak to travel and needed further medical assessment. What had begun as a planned celebration of family unity had turned into a nightmare of illness, leaving many of us hospitalized with complications from the food poisoning. Dorothy spent 2 weeks in a Puerto Rican hospital, battling kidney failure and septic shock. She eventually recovered physically, but the woman who had once been so excited to bring her family together for a dream trip was never quite the same afterward. She developed a lasting phobia of restaurants and group dining, and she never again mentioned going on another family vacation. A subsequent lawsuit revealed that the cruise line had been cited multiple times for food safety violations months prior to our journey, but had failed to address the issues. The experience profoundly changed our family's outlook on food safety and travel, especially on cruise ships, where thousands rely on the kitchen's hygiene standards, and a single lapse can lead to chaos in confined spaces. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration of family, the kind of trip Dorothy had envisioned as a once-in-a-lifetime event, became a traumatic ordeal, leaving many of us with lasting health problems and a deep distrust of cruise dining operations. Whenever I see glossy advertisements showcasing lavish buffets and happy vacationers, I think back to how swiftly paradise can turn into a medical catastrophe when basic food safety protocols are neglected. I remember Dorothy, unconscious in that helicopter, fighting for her life after simply trying the chef's special crab salad on what was supposed to be the best week of her life. Back in March 2020, just 2 weeks before the world shut down due to COVID-19, Greg and I managed to squeeze in what we thought might be our last chance at a vacation for a long time, a 7-day Western Caribbean cruise aboard Royal Caribbean's Allure of the Seas. We had been planning this trip for months to celebrate Greg's recovery from a minor heart attack he had suffered the previous year. Our doctor had cleared him for travel, emphasizing that we should take it easy and avoid strenuous activities. The timing felt perfect, and we looked forward to what we hoped would be a carefree escape. We had just escaped the start of what everyone was calling flu season, and spent a week basking in the warm Caribbean sunshine, visiting ports we'd never seen before. The Allure of the Seas was one of those colossal floating cities that Royal Caribbean is renowned for, carrying over 6,000 passengers and boasting everything from rock-climbing walls to ice skating rinks. Our balcony cabin on Deck 9 offered a stunning view of the ocean, and for the first few days, as we sailed through the Gulf of Mexico toward our initial destination, everything felt just like the relaxing vacation we had eagerly anticipated. Greg seemed more energetic than he had in months, and I finally relaxed after a taxing year filled with worries about his health and our mounting medical bills. Our third port of call was Costa Maya, Mexico, a purpose-built cruise port designed specifically to handle the enormous ships that bring thousands of tourists to the Yucatan Peninsula each week. The port area itself was essentially a large shopping and dining complex, surrounded by tour operators offering excursions to ancient Mayan ruins, cenotes, beaches, and other local attractions. Greg and I had booked what seemed like a perfectly safe, relaxing tour. A guided visit to the Chachoben ruins, about an hour inland, followed by lunch at a local restaurant and some free time to explore the quaint nearby town. The tour was operated by Maya Adventures, a company with excellent reviews on the cruise line's excursion website, promising air-conditioned transportation, professional guides, and a worry-free experience for travelers of all ages. When we disembarked in Costa Maya around 8:12 a.m., the port was bustling with thousands of passengers from 3 different ships, all eager to explore this unfamiliar part of Mexico. The Maya Adventures group comprised about 30 passengers, mostly middle-aged Americans like ourselves, loading onto a modern, air-conditioned bus driven by a friendly Mexican named Carlos, who spoke excellent English and appeared knowledgeable about local history and sites. Our guide, Maria, was a young woman raised in the region, passionate about Mayan culture and the archaeological sites we'd visit. During the first hour of our drive through small villages and lush jungle landscapes, everything felt exactly like the cultural experience we'd hoped for. The Chachoben ruins were absolutely mesmerizing, a complex of ancient pyramids and temples nestled deep within dense jungle, where howler monkeys called from the treetops and vibrant birds darted overhead. Maria led us through the site, sharing stories of the Maya civilization and pointing out architectural details that made these ruins come alive. Her animated explanations made us feel like we were witnessing something truly extraordinary. Greg snapped photos non-stop, more excited and engaged than I'd seen him in ages, and I thought to myself that this trip was exactly what he needed to regain his confidence and zest for life. But around noon, as we wrapped up our tour and prepared to head back to the bus for lunch, the peaceful atmosphere suddenly shattered. As we approached the parking area, Loud shouting and what sounded like gunfire echoed from the direction where our bus should have been waiting. Maria's face went pale. She hurried us along a different path away from the parking lot, speaking rapidly in Spanish into a cell phone she pulled from her bag, broken English mixed with obvious panic. She explained that there had been some kind of problem with local police, and we needed to stay away from the main road until the situation was safe. Huddled behind a partially reconstructed temple wall, we could hear the gunshots growing closer, coupled with the roar of vehicles racing through the jungle roads and men shouting in Spanish. Suddenly, Carlos, our bus driver, appeared running through the trees. Blood streaked across his forehead from a cut, shouting something in rapid Spanish that caused Maria to start crying. Over the next tense hour, we learned that our tour had coincidentally arrived at Chachoben on the very day a violent territorial dispute had erupted nearby between rival drug cartels. According to Carlos, who had witnessed the beginning of the chaos, armed men had set up roadblocks on the main highway back to Costa Maya, stopping several tourist buses. Passengers were robbed, and in some cases, taken hostage to be used as bargaining chips in the unfolding conflict. Our bus, parked openly at the ruins entrance, had been shot at and rendered inoperable, leaving us stranded deep within the Yucatan jungle with no transportation and no way to communicate beyond this embattled zone. Throughout the afternoon, sporadic gunfire pierced the thick canopy, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Maria managed to contact other tour operators on her phone, and the news grew more alarming with each update. Multiple groups were stranded across different locations, and the main roads were under armed guard. Mexican military authorities were mobilizing to deal with what officials called a serious security crisis. But hours could pass before they could intervene, and we found ourselves trapped in the ruins with limited water, no food, and no certainty about when or if it would be safe to attempt a return to the cruise ship. Greg, who had been in good health during the trip, started showing signs of stress-related heart issues. The extreme heat, dehydration, fear, and the physical exertion of maneuvering through the jungle took a heavy toll on his recovering heart. I watched him struggle to breathe amid the humid air, trying to stay calm despite the chaos around us. Several other passengers were also suffering. An elderly woman showed symptoms of heat exhaustion, and a man with diabetes was running dangerously low on insulin, which he had left on the bus, assuming it would only be a few hours. By 4 p.m., we had been hiding in the ruins for over 4 hours when Maria received a call that could determine whether we would survive. A local contact had arranged a helicopter rescue for several stranded groups, but the pickup points were perilous, requiring us to traverse dangerous, cartel-controlled territory. The alternative was to stay hidden overnight in the ruins, praying that the military would restore order by morning. Having no food, limited water, and several ill among us, staying put might be as risky as trying to reach safety. Deciding to attempt the helicopter evacuation, we prepared to walk 2 miles through dense jungle to a clearing where the helicopter could land. Maria warned us that we might encounter armed men during the trek. If stopped, complete cooperation was our best defense. The journey was a nightmare. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow, could have been an armed attacker. The constant threat of an ambush kept us frozen with fear, knowing that we depended entirely on the mercy of criminals and guides who might not hesitate to use violence. Greg was noticeably worse, his breathing shallow, and his face gray, recalling the day he nearly died. Yet we had no choice but to push forward, clinging to hope that his heart could withstand the effort until rescue arrived and he could receive proper medical care. We reached the landing site just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sight of a Mexican military helicopter descending into the jungle clearing was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The evacuation was swift and efficient. Passengers were quickly loaded aboard and flown directly to Costa Maya's port, where medical teams and local authorities awaited. The flight lasted less than 20 minutes, but from above, we could see several smoldering spots along the roads, with military vehicles rushing toward unfolding conflicts below. By 8 p.m., we were back on the ship, 12 hours after what should have been a simple cultural tour. Greg immediately headed to the medical center for a cardiac checkup. The ship's medical team confirmed that, while his heart showed signs of strain, he hadn't suffered another attack. Rest and close monitoring should suffice for now. Yet the trauma of what we'd endured in Mexico lingered, and it would take months for both of us to fully process the psychological scars left by that terrifying ordeal. The cruise line offered full refunds for the excursion and took responsibility for Greg's medical expenses, but they also emphasized that passengers who chose to disembark at foreign ports did so at their own risk. They warned that the safety and security conditions in many Caribbean and Mexican destinations could change suddenly and without warning. Later, we discovered that our group had been among over 200 cruise passengers caught in the middle of cartel violence that day. We learned that several tourist buses had been set ablaze, with their passengers robbed, before military forces regained control of the area. That harrowing experience transformed our perspective on shore excursions drastically. It dawned on us that stepping off a cruise ship in a foreign port meant entering a zone where you had no influence over local politics, crime, or security, all of which could turn deadly in an instant. What had seemed like a safe, organized tour run by reputable companies suddenly felt like a fight for survival amid a drug war, with the ancient ruins we had longed to explore now serving as our refuge, while armed criminals controlled the roads around us. Every time I see those glossy cruise brochures advertising exotic shore excursions, I recall that terrifying day in the Yucatan jungle. I remind myself that paradise can swiftly turn into hell once you leave the safety of your floating hotel and enter a world where your cruise ship's security and medical facilities are powerless to protect you.